So this week, the focus is going to be primary history. And, Stuart, you're someone who we've been looking to have on the podcast for a very long time. We really respect your work and the contribution you make to the education community in general. And so I'm going to adopt the position of your, I don't know, what's the polite way to describe the bumbling fool who just sort of asks questions, because I'm very interested in history. I read about history, but in terms of history pedagogy and having almost like a philosophical approach to it, it's not quite my most developed subject. And so I think it makes sense. And Stuart, are you okay if I throw this your way? First question is, what is primary history?
Yes. So one of the things that I found over the last few years since I've started working less as just a subject lead and classroom lead and working across the country supporting schools with things like curriculum design and staff CPD is that primary history is a glorious mess. And I deliberately went for a provocative start because it was fun and it made me smile. The thing about history is there is no singularity. Very rarely will you get agreement on something being certain or factually accurate. And when we take that right back to the start of what we do in primary school, this is our introduction to children of going, right, you're going to be learning about abstract worlds that actually happened. You're going to be going back in time far beyond what we can comprehend. And our job is to make sense of it. So it's that earliest steps into that journey. I pulled up a couple of things just while I was thinking about it. I mean, the lovely Neil Armand might enjoy it if we start with a bit of Greek etymology, because it genuinely is quite a useful place to start. So I was looking this up, histor, as in learned and wise man. So it's that academia side of it. So instead of just learning a set of facts and therefore having the answer, we actually need to do something with them. We need to carefully construct understanding. And then you get historia, which is finding out narrative. Narratives are utterly vital when we think about history in whatever level. If you don't have a narrative, then you're going to get isolated episodes, which means we won't make those all-important questions. I mentioned before the book "What is History" by E.H. Carr. I'm just going to quote him because I love it. It's a wonderful explanation. This is its most academic sense. What is history? It is a continuous process of interaction between the historian and his facts, an unending dialogue between the present and the past. So it's it's almost like a conversation where we look back at what happened and try and make sense of it. Our jobs as primary teachers is the narrator of that story. And I've kind of come to use that metaphor quite readily because primary teachers tend to know far more about English teaching because that's what lots of ITE courses focus on, and rightly so. But if we use that idea of a narrator, it helps them understand the role is to kind of guide through this assortment of things that are going to be put across.
I love that sense when you said there about history is something that we do, and there's this sense of interpretation and narrative. I was listening to a podcast a while back when they were talking, which was about the pulling down of the statue in Bristol of Colston, and I remember a lot of it was a historian on the podcast who was complaining, rightly so, about the number of commentators who were saying things like, oh, you're changing history, or you're trying to reinterpret history. And their point was, no, that is history. The reinterpretation and the better and deeper understanding of events that have come before is history. And the idea of saying that, no, we've got it fixed and we know what it is and it's set and we don't need to reinterpret it and understand it more deeply from our own times is a misinterpretation. That is fundamentally ahistorical. So I loved when you were talking there about the idea of there being a narrative, but also a sense of interpretation, because that's what I've come to think about when it comes to history as well. I guess kind of linked to that, I mean, I don't know if this speaks to your expertise or experience either. Do you think there are any kind of differences or significant differences between, or obvious differences between primary history specifically and secondary history? Or I know you're like a primary expert, but is there anything off the top of your head that you think, well, I've looked a little bit at the Key Stage 3 curriculum and this is surprisingly similar or surprisingly different?
That's a really interesting question, and something that I've had a couple of requests to go and speak to secondary teachers about of late, of what is primary history. There are fundamental differences, and it's a personal, not a gripe, not a concern, but it's that kind of inkling of currently, if people tried to read the research reviews, the research review history had a lot of references in there. I think I'm pretty confident we're talking 3 digits. 5 of them were primary specific. The current model is very much influenced by secondary practice, and secondary teachers, because they are specialists, have a lot that they can inform and support primary teachers with. And hands up, I have learned lots from secondary teachers that I've encountered. But, and here's the defense of the primaryness, as Emma Turner likes to call it. The joy of the primary curriculum is it is interconnected. The joy of the primary curriculum is we can sit there and go, we can add breadth to their knowledge in ways that secondary schools can't, because we're not in a departmental structure. So I think of some of my favorite lessons to support children when I've been teaching, and my favorite moments are when they make an interdisciplinary link. For example, when I was teaching the Romans to year 3, we made mosaics in arts, and to make it a purposeful historical link, all I did was ask them, now that you've made your mosaics, how has that helped you understand the Romans? And these children at the age of 7, they could understand and quite eloquently explain why they would only be found in the wealthiest homes. They were making connections that I hadn't led them down about the role of the empire in terms of trade, because they were thinking about where would you get the dyes for the colours. So all of those things is where we can get things where we can get that breadth, as Christine Council call it, that hinterland knowledge. I'm not going to start spouting about reading, because Chris will get very overexcited and start diving in. But actually, when we read high quality historical fiction, that adds that sense of time and place. There's really wonderful historical thinkers, Ian Dawson, who is magnificent. If you want to learn about history, Ian Dawson is a go-to. And he talks about that development of the sense of time, place, and period. And then Mike Hill wrote a brilliant blog a while ago on world building, and he compares creating those abstract historical worlds with the work of Tolkien, because the function of the early lessons in history is to build that world, to develop that sense of period, in the same way as the early chapters of a book help build that world in which the narrative takes place. Because if we don't do that, the narrative doesn't make sense, because the world's so fundamentally different. The one thing that I do feel we run the risk of is, if we don't really consider what a history lesson is, then we go back to that malaise of a topic-led approach, which is where it can go wrong. When it's done well, it's a beautiful thing. But what I've tried to do is distinguish between a history lesson and a lesson that adds historical knowledge, because that is a fine line. And I'm very open to contestation on this, because it's not a perfect model by any stretch of the imagination. To me, in primary schools, we sometimes mix things unintentionally. But a history lesson to me is a lesson that provides not only factual knowledge, not only helps them develop that historian's toolkit, but the way in which that knowledge is interpreted is in a historical way. If we don't interpret in a historical way, is it actually a history lesson? That's where I would start to question that.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that? Because that just reminds me of something that's come up in conversations a
Please
few
do.
times. There's been a bit of a hoo-ha I've seen on Twitter a few times, where someone has taken an aspect of history and then said, well, something that we did following our learning, and they've not said whether it was in a history lesson or not or elsewhere, but they've said, we then talked about the potentially like the ethics of something. So, for example, they might have talked about if you think about the Benin bronzes, and they've then said, we then looked into that and talked and began to discuss these partly within the historical context, but bearing that in mind, we started to think about the ethics behind it. And often people will immediately jump in and say, but that's not history. You can't do that. And there's part of me that thinks, well, why not? Well, even if it is, why can't we make that link? If we're clear with students and say, actually, we're now talking more about ethics, which we would consider as part of philosophy, and then we're kind of branching away from history now, I don't think that's a bad thing. I actually think that's quite an interesting way to go. But, or do you see, or do you disagree with that? Do you think there's perhaps a danger, and that once you've learned about something in history, talking about the ethics around it or some other aspect of the curriculum might confuse kids?
That is a nightmare of a question in the best possible way. It is a nightmare of a question, because there are so many kind of thought processes that play a role. In terms of, it's, you know, as with pretty much everything, the devil's in the detail. And I have a vague recollection of a conversation I saw between some university academics. I think it was Arthur Chapman, another brilliant master of all things teaching history. And they were looking at the fact that in terms of the way we teach history in Britain, we don't tend to include the ethics within that. But I've got a real flickering in my head of, I think some countries do. Canada jumps out that when they teach history in Canada, the two are interwoven. In terms of for primary schools, it must be done very, very carefully, because if we're not careful, we run the risk of putting our 21st century value judgments onto an ancient world where that doesn't quite fit. The way in which we label things today is different to how it was perceived in the past. The example, my go-to example that I often use is the Athenian democracy. And often it's introduced, who could vote? Male citizens could vote, women couldn't vote. Well, that's not fair. And I've seen children get really angry about that, because their only knowledge of the world is that women can vote and there is voting equality, there's equal enfranchisement. So therefore, this isn't fair. If that's not given suitable historical context, that can really get out of hand. What I mean when I say that is, if we think about when women were given the vote in this country, or granted the vote's a better phrase, it's equal voting came in less than a century ago. So in the huge narrative arc, that's quite recently. And then if we look back and compare the Athenian democracy with Spartan oligarchy, with the monarchies of various ilks that they'll study throughout Key Stage 2, if we just settle that it's not fair, I'd suggest we've possibly missed part of the point, in that, no, it wasn't fair. But when you compare it to everything else, it was a huge step in the right direction, so therefore it was fairer. And that's where I think we just need to be mindful. Sometimes we are going to put our value judgments on parts of history because they were abhorrent and can never happen again. This is why in the whole of the history curriculum, the only thing specified that must be taught is the Holocaust in Key Stage 3. And that can never, ever happen again. So when people kind of say, do we need to give not a balanced account, but not a one-sided perspective on things like the slave trade? No, absolutely. It was abhorrent. It was morally reprehensible. It was absolutely grotesque. So examples like that, but it must be very carefully considered. What, if we just go back a step to the nature of the primary curriculum, in terms of an ethical sense, that's a perfect avenue to go down in PSHE and English lessons, because you don't need to have history. The historical knowledge becomes a vehicle for a different manner of thinking. That to me is more of a safe route to explore it, but it doesn't take away, the relevance, because the Benin bronzes being returned, I don't think many people would object to.
Thanks. That's just like fascinating answer. And yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There's so much complexity in there. And I liked what you said there about the idea of separating it out and saying, look, we can use this knowledge, but it's probably quite sensible for us to kind of pen that in by saying, and we're now doing this within kind of PSHE, so that pupils actually recognize the different kinds of thinking that are involved in different kinds of lessons. So yeah, really nuanced stuff. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's awesome. I mean, Adam Smith talks about protecting RE, because RE can very quickly become citizenship and PSHE and lots of other things, and the discipline of religious studies or religious education gets missed. One question that did come to mind, I think the phrase was, if you're not giving it a historical analysis, then it's not history. If someone's listening, maybe started their career, and they're wondering, well, what does that mean for me and my behaviours as a teacher? What would you say to them?
First of all, I'd say have a go, because having a go is far better than not. The way in which I kind of put that across, it sounds quite partisan. A history lesson having that sense of historical interpretation, that to me is kind of a benchmark of, yeah, that's very much more likely to be a history lesson. Are there going to be examples where that wouldn't be the case? Probably, but it's a nightmare to try and think of every eventuality. In terms of an early career teacher, let's say, or a teacher who doesn't have a background in history, because theoretically you could be leading history in a primary school and have not learned it since the end of year 9, which is the nature of primary education. The difficulty with history, as I said before, is it's not agreed. Therefore, what we need to do is be very deliberate and specific about what we are going to teach the children. So before we start, let's have a really clear impression of what we want to accomplish. Because if you've got that, it becomes a much easier prospect. And I know lots of people look at the curriculum for history and think it's really open-ended. And that's because it is. When it was released in 2013, there's a video on YouTube from Alf Wilkinson, who was the Historical Association CPD manager at that stage, saying that's exactly what it is, and deliberately so. Because the joy of it, if you know what you're doing, is it allows you to craft a meaningful and purposeful curriculum. However, if history is not your background, then that becomes very problematic. So therefore, for primary schools, that's much more likely to be the case. So what I would do is I'd start with the actual objectives themselves, because they are the ones we are required to teach. And then once you've looked at that, look really carefully and go, so what do my children need to know? I remember when I started teaching in 2000, and when I was training in the early kind of mid 2000s, it was very much lots of activities. It was very much a different pedagogy. We're not going down the VAC rabbit hole again, because that's been obviously debunked. But what we need to do is look and go, so what do I need to teach? Because if you define what you need to teach, that becomes easy to go and find it and to be able to do it in an easy way. And because history is so massive, it's the story of humanity, it's literally everything. You can't teach everything. It is impossible to teach everything. People spend their whole careers and lives learning about niche aspects of it. So as primary teachers, what we need to do is we need to look and go, this is what I must cover. So that's what I'm going to do. And then when you come back to it, if you're still in the same year group, then you can enhance, but start with being really deliberate. Don't leave it last minute and then post on social media, does anybody have any lovely activities for this? Because a lovely activity means they might have a nice time, and you might get lucky, they'll learn something. But unless you plan that linear sequence, the narrative arc of history is unlikely to come across.
I mean, one of the good things that does exist in the primary curriculum related to history is a nice set of concepts that are directly related to like the disciplinary knowledge of history. So, you know, cause and consequence. I've got a list of them here, like continuity and change, similarity, etc. I think generally speaking, if you're supporting pupils while teaching them about interesting historical stuff, you are supporting them to understand these concepts better, you're probably doing okay. If you're like at the start of your career and you're thinking, well, am I actually teaching history? If they are grasping these concepts to a better level through some different examples that you're teaching across your curriculum, you're probably not going too far wrong, I'd say.
I'd possibly go a step further and say you sound like you're doing a pretty good job. In terms of those historical concepts, they can't be taught separately. They cannot be an ad hoc add-on. So if you know you're going to be focused on changes, then right at the start, make sure the children know that, because then they'll start to apply that knowledge across and go, now we've learned about this and that. How did it change? When did it change? What changed? And for younger children especially, have those as prompts every time. I have no issue, and I mean, I'm going to put this out there. I frequently reuse the same slide, mainly to build up fluency, to go, this is how we're going to draw our answers. We're looking at what changed, how it changed. Just a word of warning on one of them, because this is a really common mistake that's been picked up on by Tim Jenner at Ofsted. Significance. In primary schools, we are not teaching full historical significance. It is incredibly complex, it is incredibly nuanced, and you have to have a huge wealth of contextual knowledge. So even though the word significance is mentioned in 3 out of the 4 objectives for Key Stage 1 history, don't worry if you look up historical significance. Start in a really simple way of what significant means. So if something is significant, if it's worthy of remembrance, if it's worthy of remembrance, it doesn't mean famous. That's really common misconception. Don't call them famous people, because think of Mary Anning. Mary Anning has only just got a statue thanks to the campaign of a little girl. Mary Anning's significance has only recently been, revealed in the context. So just think about it in those ways. And I liked when you were bringing up about the, I totally agree. It's not erasing history. We're telling different stories. That's all we're doing. We're broadening horizons by telling different stories. If we don't tell those stories, the children may miss out on a really incredible role model. Just because they're not one of the big hitters doesn't mean that we can't do that. And we also shouldn't underappreciate the intelligence of younger children. So if you're looking at one of the big hitters like Columbus, let's go for, instead of asking, why should we remember Christopher Columbus, change one word and the meaning is fundamentally different. How should we remember Christopher Columbus? Because in a simple level, we can introduce the fact that people are complex. The fact that, yes, from this perspective, they are significant. They did amazing things. However, it's not all good. And it's absolutely fine. It's absolutely fine and valid to do that.
I loved what you said there about using the same slide. I couldn't help but hark back to a previous episode with Sarah Cottingham. She's interested in Ausubel, and so currently she's thinking about things in terms of organization of knowledge, and in particular the idea of anchoring concepts or subsumers, and this idea of this thing helps us to understand this higher, more abstract, more generalized idea, helps us to understand the bits that are examples of that. And so when you were talking about start off with change, start off with the idea of change, foreground the idea that we are going to be learning about this higher order concept of change, how things change, why things change, what are the consequences of that. Start off with that, and as a like anchoring concept, and then build what's coming from that. I thought that was a really interesting thing you said there, and tied in quite nicely with the way that she thinks or is currently thinking about Ausubel's work.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting one, because there are lots of different ways to do this. And I think one of the things I've realized over the last few years as you become more of an experienced teacher is you look and go, this works. And I have to confess, I wouldn't have thought of it in the same way as you've just explained it, but actually, yes, it does make sense. The way I like to think about it is, if you know what you're going to be using as a vehicle for the answer, why wouldn't you front load it? As opposed to, right, now you've learned this, let's look at this massive swathe of information and look at the changes. Whereas what I tend to do, and have done for the past few years at least, is you build that understanding as you go. So it's interwoven with that factual knowledge, because if you do that, it's less on the cognitive load. You can do it in small steps, and it becomes easier to retrieve and find and plot that pathway along.
Yeah, and if we talk about attention being the big difference maker in the classroom, if you're like priming the kids where your attention is going to go, I think you're definitely setting them up for success. It makes a lot of sense. I really hope that someone's listening and you have been the first person to tell them that VAC isn't a thing. And they're like, they drop their coffee cup and they're like, what? They call their sister on the phone.
It genuinely makes me giggle, because I honestly remember the lesson plans I was doing at university, because that was the research that was being used. So the use of academic research, I certainly was making use of it whilst I was training. I think it was Black and Williams formative assessment stuff, absolute benchmarks, still influences the way I work and the way I think today. It's just what we have to do is, and it's part of being a that historian's craft, is we need to interrogate. The joy of one of the things about being a historian that I read was every historian expects their work to be superseded. And this is an unending conversation of, let's just have another look at that. Does it still stack up? And it doesn't matter what discipline, whether it's educational research or cognitive science, does that still stack up? Does it need refining? And I think that's just the nature of good quality development.